On September 14, 1847, inside a plantation house 12 miles south of Charleston, South Carolina, something occurred that would haunt the American South for generations. 7 members of the Grantham family were found dead in their beds, their throats cut with surgical precision. Clean. Deliberate. Unmistakably practiced. There were no signs of struggle. No shattered furniture. No screams reported by neighboring estates. Only silence, thick and suffocating, hanging over the white-columned mansion like a burial shroud. The sole person missing from the plantation was a young man named Samuel, purchased 3 years earlier for the astonishing sum of $750. Not for his strength in the cotton fields. Not for his skill with horses or carpentry. But because his skin was white as porcelain, his hair like spun silver, and his eyes carried an unnatural hue, pale pink, almost translucent, like looking into the soul of something not quite human. The Granthams had called him their living curiosity. Their scientific specimen. Their prized possession to display at dinner parties while Charleston's elite marveled at nature's aberration. The Charleston Courier printed exactly one article about the murders. 72 hours later, its owner received a private visit from 3 of the wealthiest planters in South Carolina. No further coverage ever appeared. No trial was held. No body was recovered. The story, like Samuel himself, simply vanished into the humid southern night. But this didn't happen in one night of blind rage. This didn't happen in a moment of uncontrolled fury. This took 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days of perfect, calculated, ice-cold patience. Before we continue with the story of Grantham Plantation and the man they reduced to a curiosity, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel, because we uncover the histories that others tried to bury. And there are so many more waiting in the shadows. Now, let's step back. Back to the beginning. Back to May 1844, when Thaddeus Grantham made the worst purchase of his life. The Charleston slave market on Chalmers Street smelled of sweat, fear, and money. On a humid Tuesday morning in May 1844, the auction block was crowded with planters evaluating human property the way they'd examine horses or furniture. Calculating. Appraising. Reducing lives to dollar signs. Thaddeus Grantham stood near the front, a tall man with graying temples and the kind of cold, analytical eyes that missed nothing, or so he believed. At 48, he owned a moderately successful plantation, 2,000 acres of cotton along the Ashley River, worked by 340 enslaved people whose names he barely knew and whose humanity he never considered. But Thaddeus fancied himself more than just a planter. He was a man of science. A natural philosopher. He'd written papers on crop rotation and soil composition. He subscribed to medical journals from Philadelphia and Boston. His library contained over 300 volumes, many of them concerning what he called the science of racial characteristics. It was this obsession that brought him to the market that morning, accompanied by his factor, Edmund Rutledge, a thin man with calculating eyes who handled the buying and selling of human property with the same attention he gave to cotton futures. "I'm not looking for field hands," Thaddeus told Edmund as they walked past the auction block. "I need something different. Something that would advance scientific understanding." Edmund raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He'd learned over the years that Thaddeus's enthusiasms, once ignited, burned until they exhausted themselves. That's when they saw him. Standing on the auction block, shackled but somehow unbowed, was a young man who made the crowd murmur and step back instinctively. His skin was pale, not the tan of a white man who'd worked outdoors, but an almost translucent white that seemed to glow in the morning sun. His hair, cropped short, was white blonde, like an old man's, though he couldn't have been more than 20. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled people. Pink. Not red, but a soft rose color that reflected light in an unsettling way. The auctioneer, a man named Harwick who'd sold thousands of human beings in his career, seemed uncertain how to proceed. "Gentlemen," Harwick called out, his voice projecting across the crowd. "What we have here is a truly unique specimen. A male Negro, approximately 22 years of age, literate and educated, afflicted with a rare condition that produces this unusual coloring. The previous owner, a deceased planter from Virginia, used him as a house servant. He's healthy, intelligent, and I guarantee you won't find another like him anywhere in the South." Thaddeus felt his heart racing. An albino. He'd read about the condition in medical journals, but had never seen one in person. The scientific possibilities flooded his mind. He could document the condition, measure its effects, write papers that would be published in prestigious journals. His name could become known in medical circles from Charleston to Boston. "What's his history?" a planter near Thaddeus called out. "Born in Maryland, educated by his previous owner who was something of an eccentric," Harwick replied. "Can read, write, knows basic arithmetic. The condition doesn't affect his mental faculties, only his appearance. Thaddeus leaned toward Edmund. I want him. He'll be expensive, Edmund warned. Look at him. He's useless for fieldwork. That skin would burn to blisters in an hour under the sun. And that appearance, it'll unsettle the other slaves, might cause problems. I don't want him for fieldwork, Thaddeus said, his eyes never leaving Samuel. I want him for study. On the auction block, Samuel stood perfectly still, his pink eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that made several men look away. He'd been here before, 4 times in the past 3 years since his previous owner's death had sent him back into the market. 4 different owners, each drawn by his unusual appearance, each treating him as a curiosity rather than a human being. But Samuel had learned things in those 3 years. Important things. He'd learned that educated slaves made white people nervous. That his appearance could unsettle even cruel men. That freedom papers could be forged if you were patient enough to practice the handwriting. That people who viewed you as a curiosity never really looked at you carefully. They saw the unusual coloring but missed the intelligence calculating behind those strange eyes. Most importantly, Samuel had learned to wait. As the bidding began, Samuel watched Thaddeus Grantham with those unsettling pink eyes. He saw the scientific hunger there, the collector's pride, the assumption of superiority. He saw a man who thought he was about to make a brilliant acquisition. What Thaddeus Grantham couldn't see, was that Samuel was watching him back. Studying. Evaluating. Making calculations of his own. The bidding climbed higher than Harwick had expected. Thaddeus faced competition from 2 other planters, both drawn by the novelty. But Thaddeus was determined, driven by visions of scientific papers and recognition from the medical community. $750, Thaddeus called out, a sum that made Edmund cough and several other bidders shake their heads. The crowd went silent. It was nearly twice what you'd pay for a prime field hand. Sold, Harwick declared, bringing his hammer down with a crack that echoed across the market like a gunshot. To Mr. Thaddeus Grantham. Papers were signed. Money exchanged hands. Samuel was unshackled from the auction block and led to Thaddeus's wagon, his movement smooth and unhurried. He climbed into the back without being told, his hands now bound with rope that wasn't strictly necessary but was traditional for a new purchase. As the wagon pulled away from the Charleston market, Edmund broke the uncomfortable silence. What exactly do you plan to do with him? That's nearly twice what you'd pay for a prime field hand. Thaddeus watched the road ahead, his mind already racing with possibilities. Study him, Edmund. Document the condition. Think of the scientific value. We're living in an age of discovery, of understanding the natural world in ways our fathers never could. This young man is a living, breathing example of nature's variations. What Thaddeus didn't say, what he perhaps didn't even recognize in himself yet, was that he'd purchased more than a subject for study. He'd acquired something he believed made him special, a collector's pride in possessing what no one else had. In the back of the wagon, hands bound with rope that wouldn't hold him if he truly wanted to escape, Samuel stared at the passing landscape with those unsettling pink eyes and said nothing at all. But inside his mind, a clock had started ticking. Day 1. 1,342 days to go. Samuel had learned something in his 22 years of enslavement, something that most people never understood: patient men always win. Not the strong men. Not the violent men. The patient ones. The ones who could smile while being humiliated. Obey while planning rebellion. Serve while calculating revenge. The ones who understood that 3 years of perfect patience could accomplish what 3 minutes of rage never could. As the wagon rolled toward Grantham Plantation, carrying Thaddeus toward his scientific triumph and Samuel toward his methodical vengeance, the afternoon sun beat down on the South Carolina low country. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming. But not yet. Not for 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days. Samuel could wait. The other enslaved people at Grantham Plantation first saw Samuel when he arrived that evening, and the response was immediate and visceral. Some made signs against evil. Others simply stared, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. The field hands whispered among themselves in the fading light. Virgil Cates, the overseer, a brutal man who enforced discipline with a whip he called Persuader, seemed uncertain how to classify this new arrival. He'd spent 20 years categorizing human property into simple categories: field hands, house servants, skilled labor, but Samuel didn't fit into any of them. "Where you want this one, Mr. Grantham?" Virgil asked, his hand instinctively touching the whip coiled at his belt. "The main house," Thaddeus replied, to the overseer's visible surprise. "The small room off the kitchen, in the servants' quarters." He'll be living there. Virgil's weathered face showed his confusion, but he knew better than to question his employer's decisions. Yes, sir. Though the others won't like it. That pale skin, it ain't natural. Makes folks uneasy. Good, Thaddeus said, already dismounting from the wagon. Fear breeds respect. Besides, Samuel won't be working with them. His purpose is entirely different. That first night, Samuel was given the small room Thaddeus had mentioned. It was barely 8 feet by 6, with a narrow bed, a single window that overlooked the kitchen garden, and a door that, Samuel noted immediately, locked from the outside but could easily be picked from the inside if needed. He lay awake on the thin mattress, his pale hands folded across his chest, his pink eyes reflecting the moonlight through the single window. He listened to the sounds of the plantation settling into sleep. The rhythm of it. The patterns. Thaddeus and his wife Constance retired at 10 o'clock. He could hear their voices through the ceiling, muffled but distinct. The 3 Grantham children, Margaret, 16, Thomas Jr., 13, and little Catherine, 8, were on the 3rd floor. Their footsteps had stopped around 9. The house had 47 steps from his room to the master bedroom. He'd counted them as Thaddeus had given him the tour earlier. 3 of those steps creaked. The 14th, the 23rd, and the 39th. The study window on the 1st floor didn't latch properly. Samuel had noticed that detail while Thaddeus was showing him the library, the plantation records, the scientific equipment he'd be using for his observations. Small details. Tiny cracks in the fortress. Samuel filed them all away in his perfect memory. He'd learned young that survival meant observation. When you were someone's property, you learned to read faces, to anticipate moods, to see danger before it arrived. But over the past 3 years, Samuel had elevated observation to an art form. He didn't just watch people. He studied them. Their patterns. Their weaknesses. Their blind spots. And Thaddeus Grantham had so many blind spots. The first week at Grantham Plantation was devoted to what Thaddeus called initial documentation. He measured Samuel's skull with calipers, recording the dimensions in careful columns in a leather-bound journal. He tested Samuel's vision in different light conditions, his hearing, his reflexes. Samuel endured it all with carefully cultivated patience, his face blank, while inside him something cold and calculating took root. Fascinating, Thaddeus muttered during one session, holding Samuel's arm up to examine the pale skin more closely. The pigmentation is completely absent. Even the blood vessels are visible beneath the surface. It's as if you're made of porcelain. Yes, sir, Samuel replied, his voice neutral. Tell me, Samuel, does the condition cause you pain? Only in direct sunlight, sir. My skin burns easily. Thaddeus made a note. We'll need to test that systematically. Light exposure experiments at varying durations. Samuel said nothing, but he filed that information away too. Thaddeus wanted to burn him deliberately. For science. Every cruelty, Samuel was learning, would be justified as scientific inquiry. Every humiliation disguised as scholarly interest. When he wasn't being measured and documented, Samuel was given duties in the main house. He served meals, cleaned the library, polished silver, tasks that kept him close to the family but always visible, always on display. During this first month, Samuel learned the house intimately. The library held 312 books. He counted them while dusting. 17 of those books concerned navigation and geography. 23 dealt with law and legal procedures, including a volume on manumission laws that Samuel memorized during stolen moments when the family was at Sunday service. The pantry had a loose board in the corner where small items could be hidden. The kitchen had 6 knives, but only one was properly sharp. The stable was run by an elderly man named Ezra, who'd been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember and who watched Samuel with knowing eyes that saw too much. The dogs, 2 hunting hounds named Caesar and Brutus, slept in kennels near the stable. They were fed at dawn and dusk. They barked at strangers but could be quieted with scraps of meat. Samuel learned all of this in his first 30 days, while Thaddeus measured and documented and congratulated himself on his scientific acquisition. On a warm evening in July 1844, Thaddeus hosted a dinner party for several neighboring planters and their wives. It was, Samuel would learn, a common occurrence. The Grantham family's social standing depended on these performances of wealth and refinement. Samuel was dressed in formal serving attire, a black suit that made his pale skin seem even more ghostly, and instructed to serve wine in clear plates. Now, gentlemen, Thaddeus announced after the main course, his voice carrying that particular tone of pride Samuel had learned to recognize. I want to show you something truly remarkable. He gestured for Samuel to step forward into the candlelight. This is Samuel, a specimen of a rare condition called albinism. Notice the complete absence of pigmentation in the skin, hair, and eyes. I purchased him specifically to document this fascinating variation in human biology. The dinner guests leaned forward, examining Samuel like he was an exotic painting or an unusual flower arrangement. Their eyes crawled over him, fascinated and repulsed in equal measure. "Is it contagious?" one woman asked, her hand instinctively moving to her throat. "Not at all, madam," Thaddeus replied. "It's a hereditary condition, passed through bloodlines. I'm researching whether it affects mental faculties as well as physical appearance." "And does it?" asked Dr. Whitfield, a physician from Charleston who'd come specifically to see Thaddeus's famous curiosity. "That's what makes Samuel so fascinating," Thaddeus said, warming to his subject. "He's literate, articulate, capable of complex reasoning. In many ways, he demonstrates intelligence equal to, perhaps even exceeding, that of common field hands." "Extraordinary," Dr. Whitfield said, standing to examine Samuel more closely. He turned to Samuel directly. "Tell me, boy, do you understand what we're discussing? Can you comprehend the scientific nature of your condition?" Samuel's pink eyes focused on the doctor with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably. "Yes, sir," Samuel said quietly. "I understand that you're discussing me as if I were a specimen in a medical theater. As if the color of my skin makes me less than human. As if studying my appearance gives you insight into my soul." The table fell silent. Then Thaddeus laughed, a forced sound that the other guests awkwardly joined. "You see. Quite articulate. But also impudent, which is why discipline must be maintained alongside scientific observation." He waved dismissively. "That will be all, Samuel. Return to the kitchen." Samuel bowed slightly and withdrew, but not before he'd memorized every face at that table. Not before he'd noted which guests seemed uncomfortable with the display, and which ones leaned in with hungry curiosity. Not before he'd added each name to the list he was keeping in his mind. In the kitchen, he stood in the shadows, listening to their voices carry through the partially open door. "Remarkable specimen," he heard Dr. Whitfield say. "Though I wonder about the wisdom of educating them so thoroughly. Literacy can breed dangerous ideas." "Oh, Samuel is harmless," Thaddeus replied. "He understands his place. Besides, his unusual appearance ensures he could never successfully flee. Where would he go looking like that? He'd be captured within hours." Samuel's pale hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white against white. They thought his appearance made him helpless. They thought it made him dependent on their mercy. They were wrong. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Samuel made his first theft. A single sheet of paper from Thaddeus's study, acquired during a moment when the family was occupied upstairs. It was a page from the Plantation ledger, documenting his purchase. May 14, 1844, one male Negro, age 22, afflicted with albinism. Purchase price, $750. Seller, J. Harwick, Charleston Market. Samuel folded the paper carefully and hid it beneath a loose board in his room. Someday, he promised himself, he would burn this page. But not yet. First, there were things that needed to happen. 60 days at Grantham Plantation. 1,282 days to go. Samuel lay awake, listening to the house settle into sleep, and continued his studies. Little Catherine Grantham was 8 years old, with brown curls and curious eyes that saw Samuel differently than the rest of her family did. While her father viewed him as a scientific specimen and her mother as a vaguely unsettling presence, Catherine saw him as something novel and interesting. "Can you read?" she asked him one afternoon in September, finding him dusting shelves in the library. "Yes, Miss Catherine," Samuel replied carefully. "Really?" Her eyes lit up. "Father says most slaves can't read. He says it's because," she stopped, suddenly aware that what she'd been about to say might be unkind. "Because we're not intelligent enough." Samuel finished gently. "That's what many people believe." Catherine frowned, a child's simple sense of fairness struggling with the teachings of her society. "But if you can read, then that's not true, is it?" "No, Miss Catherine. It's not true." She was quiet for a moment, then brightened. "Would you read to me sometimes? Mother says I should practice my lessons, but she's always busy with household matters." Samuel understood immediately what Catherine didn't. This was an opportunity. Access to the library, to books, to knowledge he could use. "If your parents approve, Miss Catherine, I would be honored. I'll ask Father tonight." And she did, during dinner, with the innocent enthusiasm of a child who didn't understand the implications of her request. Thaddeus considered it briefly. "I suppose it would be an interesting experiment," he mused. To observe how an educated slave interacts with educational material. And it would keep Catherine occupied. He looked at Samuel, who stood in the corner waiting to serve the next course. "You may read to my daughter for 1 hour each afternoon, Samuel. I'll be monitoring your influence to ensure nothing inappropriate is discussed." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." And so began Samuel's afternoon sessions with Catherine, always supervised by either Thaddeus or Constance, always carefully monitored. But even with supervision, Samuel gained access to things he needed. Books on geography taught him the roads to Charleston, the routes north to Virginia and Pennsylvania, the locations of major cities where a fugitive might disappear. He memorized them while reading aloud to Catherine about far-off places. Books on navigation taught him how to use the stars to travel at night, how to estimate distances, how to read the land. He absorbed this information while Catherine asked innocent questions about ships and sailors. Books on law taught him the exact language used in manumission papers, the stamps and seals that made them official, the phrases that would convince a casual inspector of their legitimacy. He studied these while ostensibly helping Catherine with her grammar lessons. And perhaps most importantly, the library sessions gave him time to observe Thaddeus's handwriting. The way he formed his letters, the distinctive loop of his G, the sharp angle of his T, the flourish on his capital G. Samuel practiced in his mind, visualizing each stroke, preparing for the day when he would need to forge Thaddeus Grantham's signature on documents that would declare Samuel a free man. "You're very good at reading," Catherine told him one afternoon in October, after he'd finished a chapter from her geography primer. "Much better than Thomas. He's always stumbling over the big words." "Practice makes perfect, Miss Catherine," Samuel replied. "Samuel." She looked up at him with those guileless 8-year-old eyes. "Does it hurt?" "Does what hurt, Miss Catherine?" "Your skin. Being different. Do the other slaves treat you badly because you look strange?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Constance sat in the corner, her embroidery in her lap, listening to every word. "Sometimes being different is difficult, Miss Catherine. But we all bear the burdens we're given. Some are visible, like my appearance. Some are invisible, like the weight of being owned by another person." Constance's needle stopped moving. Her eyes lifted to Samuel's face, something like unease flickering across her features. "That's enough reading for today, Catherine," she said abruptly. "Samuel, you may return to your duties." That night, Samuel overheard Constance and Thaddeus discussing him in their bedroom. Their voices carried down through the ceiling to his small room below. "He's too articulate, Thaddeus," Constance said. "The way he speaks, it's unsettling." "And letting him read to Catherine." "It's perfectly safe," Thaddeus interrupted. "I monitor every session. Besides, Samuel understands his place. His appearance ensures he could never successfully flee. He's entirely dependent on our mercy. Still, I don't like how Catherine looks at him. As if he were a person rather than property. Catherine is a child. She'll learn the proper distinctions as she matures. In the meantime, having Samuel read to her serves my research. I'm documenting how education affects the temperament of the enslaved. It's quite fascinating." Their voices faded as they settled into sleep. Below, in his narrow room, Samuel lay awake, his pink eyes reflecting moonlight. "They think I'm dependent on their mercy," he thought. "They think my appearance makes me helpless. They think education makes me more docile, easier to control. They're wrong on all counts. And someday, very soon, they'll learn exactly how wrong they were." 4 months at Grantham Plantation. 1,038 days to go. Samuel closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He was too busy planning. Winter came to the South Carolina Low Country in December 1844, bringing cold rains and early darkness. The cotton fields lay dormant. The enslaved people huddled in their quarters against the chill. And Samuel made his first real move. It started with Ezra, the elderly man who worked in the stables. Ezra had been at Grantham Plantation for 43 years, longer than anyone else, longer than the current house had stood. He'd seen 3 generations of Granthams, watched each one corrupted by the absolute power they held over other human beings. He'd also developed, over those 4 decades, a sixth sense for trouble. And Samuel registered on that sense like a warning bell. One cold evening in late December, Samuel appeared in the stable, ostensibly checking on a horse that Thaddeus wanted ready for a morning ride. Ezra was sitting near the forge, warming his arthritic hands, when Samuel approached. "Mind if I sit?" Samuel asked quietly. Ezra gestured to a stool. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the horses shifting in their stalls and the wind whistling through gaps in the walls. You planning something? Ezra finally said. It wasn't a question. Samuel didn't deny it. How long you been here, Ezra? 43 years. Seen a lot. Too much. Then you know what they are. What they all are. Ezra nodded slowly. Don't matter if they're brutal like old Master Grantham, or scientific like this one. They all think we're property. They all sleep sound in their beds, never wondering what we might be thinking in the quarters. And what would you do, Samuel asked carefully, if someone decided to stop being property? If someone decided the debt needed collecting? Ezra looked at him for a long time, his weathered face unreadable in the firelight. I'd say that man better be patient. Better be thorough. Can't be no half measures. Can't leave witnesses to tell a different story than the one you need told. I can be patient. How patient? As long as it takes. Another silence, longer this time. There's a place, Ezra finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Deep in the swamp, about 3 miles northeast. Old cabin, half fallen. Used to be a hideout for runaways before the patrols got organized. Ain't nobody been there in years. Ground's treacherous, dogs won't track through it. If a man needed to disappear for a while. I appreciate that information, Ezra. Ain't giving you information. Just mentioning a place I know about. What you do with that knowledge ain't my concern. Ezra stood, his joints cracking. But I'll say this. You do what I think you planning, and you better make sure it's done right. Because if it ain't, every slave in South Carolina gonna pay the price. You understand? I understand. Then we ain't never had this conversation. No, sir. We haven't. Samuel returned to the main house, his mind working. He'd made his first ally, or at least his first understanding. Ezra wouldn't help directly, but he wouldn't hinder either. And the knowledge of the swamp cabin was invaluable. That same week, Samuel made his first theft of actual value. Thaddeus kept cash in his study desk, usually around $50 for household expenses. Samuel had been watching the routine for months. Thaddeus counted the money every Monday morning, replenishing it from the plantation accounts. On a Thursday evening, while the family was at dinner and Samuel was supposedly cleaning the upstairs hallway, he slipped into the study. The desk drawer wasn't locked, a casualness born of absolute power. Why would anyone steal from Master Grantham? The enslaved people didn't have access to the room, and no white person would dare. Samuel took $3. Not enough to be noticed immediately, but enough to begin his fund. He did this 4 more times over the next 2 months, always small amounts, always when he was certain of the timing. By March 1845, he'd accumulated $12, hidden in the loose board beneath his bed along with the stolen ledger page. He also stole something more valuable, a blank sheet of paper with the Grantham letterhead, taken from Thaddeus's correspondence file. And late at night, by the light of a single candle, Samuel practiced. He practiced Thaddeus's handwriting, copying it over and over on scraps of paper he'd collected, refining each letter until he could reproduce the planter's distinctive style perfectly. He practiced the legal language from the law books he'd read to Catherine, memorizing the exact phrases used in manumission documents. He drafted freedom papers, 17 different versions, each one more polished than the last, until he had a document that would pass any but the most detailed inspection. The paper declared that Samuel, having served faithfully and demonstrated unusual intelligence and character, was hereby manumitted and granted his freedom, with the right to travel unmolested throughout the United States. The date he left blank. He'd fill it in when the time came. In March 1845, Thaddeus began what he called systematic light exposure experiments. Twice a week, he made Samuel stand in direct sunlight for increasing intervals, recording the time until his skin began to redden and burn. He documented the progression meticulously, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. Samuel endured it without complaint, his face carefully neutral, even as his pale skin burned and blistered. Even as the pain became a constant, throbbing presence. Fascinating, Thaddeus muttered, examining Samuel's reddened arms after a particularly long session. The skin responds to solar radiation much more quickly than normal pigmentation would suggest. I wonder if there are internal effects as well. Organ sensitivity, perhaps. Yes, sir, Samuel said quietly, though inside him rage burned hotter than any sunburn. What Thaddeus didn't understand, what he was too arrogant to consider, was that Samuel was using these tests for his own purposes. Each session taught Samuel his limits. How long he could endure direct sun. How to recognize the early signs of burning. How to move through daylight hours if necessary. Where the shade was deepest. When clouds provided cover. And more importantly, the tests taught Samuel about pain. How to endure it. How to separate his mind from his body's suffering. How to maintain clarity of thought even when his skin felt like it was on fire. Pain, Samuel learned, was temporary. Revenge was permanent. After each session, Thaddeus would apply salve to the burns, not out of compassion, but to preserve his valuable specimen for future experiments. Samuel accepted the treatment in silence, filing away every detail. He learned that Thaddeus kept the medicine in a locked cabinet in his study. That the key was hidden in a false bottom of the middle drawer. That the cabinet also contained laudanum, which Constance took for her nervous condition. Useful information. All of it. By April 1845, Samuel had been at Grantham Plantation for 11 months. He'd learned the layout of the house so thoroughly he could navigate it blind. He'd memorized the family's routines down to the minute. He'd identified which enslaved people might be sympathetic, which would be neutral, which might betray him. He'd stolen nearly $20. He'd perfected his forgery of Thaddeus's handwriting. He'd located the weapons in the house, a hunting rifle above the fireplace, 2 pistols in Thaddeus's bedroom, various knives in the kitchen. He'd also made another crucial discovery: the dogs could be poisoned. It happened accidentally. One of the kitchen workers had thrown out some spoiled meat that Caesar got into. The dog was sick for 2 days, lethargic and unresponsive. Samuel observed carefully, noting the symptoms, the timeline, the dosage required. Knowledge was power. And Samuel was collecting knowledge like a miser hoarding gold. But perhaps the most important thing Samuel learned in that first year was this: the Grantham family had grown comfortable with him. They no longer watched him carefully. They'd stopped seeing him as a potential threat and started seeing him as part of the household furniture. Thaddeus was so focused on his scientific observations that he never noticed Samuel observing him back. Constance was so focused on maintaining her social standing that she never questioned why Samuel was always nearby, always listening. The children had grown used to his presence. Margaret ignored him. Thomas occasionally ordered him around with the casual cruelty of a boy learning to be a master. Catherine still asked him to read to her, trusting him completely. Familiarity bred carelessness. And carelessness, Samuel knew, would be their downfall. 365 days at Grantham Plantation. 977 days to go. Samuel could afford to be patient. He'd learned that lesson well. On the anniversary of his purchase, Samuel lay in his narrow bed, listening to the house sleep around him, and allowed himself a small, cold smile. They think they know me, he thought. They've measured my skull, tested my skin, documented my every physical peculiarity. They think they've catalogued everything there is to know about Samuel the Curiosity. But they've never measured the one thing that matters. They've never measured my patience. And by the time they realize their mistake, it will be far too late. Year 1 was complete. The foundation was laid. Now came the real work. Spring 1845 arrived with azaleas blooming in violent pinks and purples, their beauty incongruous against the brutality they concealed. Samuel had been at Grantham Plantation for 1 full year, and the second year would bring changes he carefully cultivated. Thaddeus's initial scientific enthusiasm had begun to wane. He'd exhausted the observable aspects of Samuel's condition, and the medical journals had shown little interest in publishing his findings. Samuel had become simply another servant, unusual to look at certainly, but ultimately just part of the household. This was exactly what Samuel needed. On a warm evening in June 1845, Thaddeus hosted another dinner party. This one was larger, more elaborate, 12 guests from Charleston's elite planter society. The dining room glittered with crystal and silver. The finest wines had been brought up from the cellar. And Samuel, as always, was on display. "Gentlemen, ladies," Thaddeus announced after the second course, his voice carrying across the table. "I want to share with you the results of my year-long study of this fascinating specimen." Samuel stood in the corner, holding a wine decanter, his face neutral as Thaddeus launched into a detailed presentation of his findings. Charts were passed around. Measurements discussed. Theories debated. "The question that has occupied me most," Thaddeus said, warming to his subject, "is whether albinism affects mental faculties as well as physical appearance. After extensive observation, I can report that this particular specimen demonstrates remarkable intelligence. He's literate, articulate, capable of complex reasoning." Dr. Whitfield, attending again, leaned forward with interest. "But surely, Thaddeus, such intelligence in a slave is more dangerous than desirable. What use is a field hand who can read?" "Ah, but that's precisely the point," Thaddeus replied. "Samuel isn't suited for fieldwork. His skin sensitivity makes outdoor labor impossible. But his intelligence makes him valuable in other ways. He's the perfect house servant, educated enough to be useful, unusual enough to be memorable, and absolutely dependent on white protection due to his appearance. Like an exotic pet, one of the wives said, her voice carrying that particular mix of fascination and revulsion that Samuel had learned to recognize. Exactly. Thaddeus beamed. A curiosity that earns its keep. The conversation continued around Samuel as if he weren't there, discussing him in the third person, debating his value, speculating about his inner life with the casual indifference of people who'd never once considered that their property might have thoughts, feelings, opinions of their own. Then Dr. Whitfield turned to Samuel directly. Tell us, boy, what do you think about when you're alone? Do you have dreams? Ambitions? Or is your mind as blank as your appearance suggests? 13 months of careful patience almost broke in that moment. Samuel felt rage rise in his throat like bile, hot and acidic. His pale hands clenched around the wine decanter so hard the crystal should have shattered. But he'd come too far to lose control now. Samuel's pink eyes met the doctor's, and in them was something that made the older man's smile falter. I dream of many things, sir, Samuel said quietly. I dream of a world where a man's worth isn't measured by the color of his skin. I dream of justice for those who've been wronged. I dream of the day when accounts are settled and debts are paid in full. The table fell silent. Then Thaddeus laughed, though it sounded forced. You see. Quite philosophical for a slave. Though perhaps a bit impudent. Samuel, you may return to the kitchen. As Samuel left the dining room, he heard one of the guests whisper, Does it bother you, Thaddeus? That intelligence? Don't you worry. Not at all, Thaddeus replied. Intelligence without power is harmless. Samuel can think all he wants. He's still property. He still belongs to me. And his unusual appearance ensures he could never successfully flee. Where would he go? He'd be recognized and returned within a day. Samuel stood in the kitchen, his back pressed against the cool wall, his breath coming in slow, measured counts. Where would I go? He thought. Everywhere and nowhere. Into the swamps where your dogs can't track. Onto the roads at night when my pale skin becomes camouflage instead of curse. Into cities where one more ghost among thousands goes unnoticed. You think my appearance is a weakness? You're wrong. It's the weapon you handed me. That night marked a fundamental shift in Samuel's planning. It was no longer theoretical. It was no longer a distant possibility. It became inevitable. The question was no longer if he would act, but when. And the answer was, soon. But not yet. There was still work to do. In August 1845, Samuel made two more crucial alliances. Dinah worked in the main house, a woman of about 40 with gentle hands and eyes that carried deep sorrow. She'd given birth to 3 children on the plantation. 2 had died in infancy. The third, a daughter named Sarah, had been sold south the previous year when Thaddeus needed quick cash to cover gambling debts. Sarah had been 7 years old. Samuel found Dinah crying in the kitchen one evening, her hands pressed to her mouth to muffle the sound. He'd said nothing, just stood in the doorway, waiting. I'm sorry, she finally whispered. Sometimes I forget she's gone. Then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again. You don't have to apologize, Samuel said quietly. Not for loving your child. Not for grieving. Dinah looked up at him, and something passed between them. A recognition. An understanding. They don't think we feel it, she said. They sell our children like cattle and expect us to go back to work the next day as if nothing happened. As if our hearts don't break just like theirs would. Samuel moved closer, his voice barely above a whisper. What would you do, Dinah, if someone made them pay? If someone collected the debt they owe for every child they've stolen, every family they've destroyed? Her eyes widened. You're planning something. I'm not planning anything. Samuel's pink eyes held hers steadily. But if something were to happen, if someone needed an alibi on a particular night, could I trust you to provide one? Dinah was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Sarah was 7. She cried for me every night before they took her away. Thaddeus didn't even remember her name. Called her, the girl, when he signed the papers. I'll remember her name, Samuel promised. When the time comes, I'll remember why. Jacob was a field hand, 28 years old, with a back covered in scars from Virgil Cates's whip. He'd been caught with a piece of paper, trying to learn his letters from a torn book page he'd found. The punishment had been 50 lashes. Samuel approached him carefully, during one of the rare moments when the field hands were near the main house. I heard what they did to you, Samuel said quietly. For trying to learn. Jacob's eyes were wary. Ain't nothing special. They do worse for less. It's not nothing. They fear educated slaves because educated slaves understand what's been stolen from them. Knowledge is power, Jacob. That's why they punish it so severely. You trying to get me in more trouble? No. I'm trying to tell you that your crime wasn't learning. Your crime was being caught. There's a difference. Jacob studied Samuel for a long moment. What do you want? Same thing I asked Dinah. If something were to happen, if someone needed to say I was somewhere I wasn't, could I trust you? Depends on what's happening. You don't need to know the details. You just need to know that everyone who benefits from this system, everyone who profits from our suffering, would have reason to fear. Jacob's scarred back seemed to tighten. They killed my sister. Worked her to death in the rice fields. She was 14. I'll remember her too, Samuel said. Then yeah. You got your alibi. 3 alliances now. Ezra, Dinah, Jacob. Not enough to help him directly, but enough to create confusion in the aftermath. Enough to provide false trails and misdirection. Samuel was building a network of silence, a conspiracy of the oppressed who would protect him not because they knew what he planned, but because they understood why. December 1845 brought early cold to South Carolina. Ice formed on the edges of the ponds, and the live oaks stood skeletal against gray skies. The Grantham family prepared for Christmas with their usual elaborate plans. Samuel prepared for something entirely different. On Christmas Eve, after serving at another dinner party where he was displayed and discussed like a curiosity, Samuel stood in his small room and made a decision. The time was coming. Not immediately, but soon. He could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. He'd spent 20 months learning, observing, preparing. He had his alliances. His tools. His knowledge. His plan. What he needed now was the right moment. The perfect opportunity when circumstances aligned to give him the best chance of success. That opportunity would come, Samuel knew. It always did for patient men. In his hidden journal, a ledger of his own that he kept beneath the loose board, Samuel wrote a single entry. They've studied me for 20 months. Measured me. Tested me. Documented me like a butterfly pinned to a board. They think they've cataloged everything there is to know about the albino specimen. But they've never seen what I'm capable of when I stop being a specimen and become what I really am, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The debt is almost calculated. Soon, very soon, it will be time to collect. Christmas Day arrived with cold rain and gray skies. The Grantham family exchanged presents in the parlor while Samuel served hot cider and maintained his neutral expression. Margaret received a new dress. Thomas got books on plantation management. Little Catherine got a porcelain doll with painted eyes and perfect skin. Samuel received nothing, as was appropriate for property. That night, alone in his room, Samuel added another name to his mental list. Another reason. Another justification. And he continued to wait. May 1846 marked 2 full years at Grantham Plantation. Thaddeus had long since stopped his systematic observations. Samuel was simply part of the household now, the unusual servant who read to Catherine, served at dinner parties, and occasionally reminded guests that the Granthams owned something no one else did. This complacency was exactly what Samuel needed. In those 24 months, he'd stolen $37. He'd perfected his forgery of Thaddeus's handwriting. He'd memorized every possible escape route through the swamps. He'd mapped the entire property down to individual trees that provided cover. He'd learned which floorboards creaked and which didn't. He'd timed the nightly rounds of the overseer. He'd studied the phases of the moon and knew when darkness would be absolute. He'd poisoned the dogs twice more, always in small, non-fatal doses, testing their reactions, learning the timeline of symptoms. He'd practiced with his stolen knife until he could strike with surgical precision in complete darkness. And he'd cultivated a reputation for perfect docility, for absolute reliability, for being exactly what they thought he was, intelligent but harmless, unusual but trustworthy, property that knew its place. 2 years of perfect patience. 730 days of playing the role they'd assigned him. 730 days of planning their destruction while they slept peacefully, convinced of their safety. On the anniversary of his 2nd year, Samuel lay in his narrow bed and smiled in the darkness. 1 more year, he thought. 1 more year of perfect patience. Then the debt comes due. And when it does, they'll learn something their scientific studies never revealed. They'll learn that the most dangerous weapon isn't strength or rage or desperation. It's patience. And I've become a master of it. 730 days at Grantham Plantation. 612 days to go. Samuel closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He was too busy planning the final year. The year that would end with 7 bodies and 1 ghost disappearing into the South Carolina night. The new year arrived with a cold snap that froze the low country solid. Ice glazed the cotton fields. The Ashley River ran slow with slush. And Thaddeus Grantham made an announcement that would seal his family's fate. It came during dinner on a frigid January evening. The family was gathered around the table, Samuel serving as always, when Thaddeus cleared his throat importantly. "I have news," he said, smiling at Constance. "Excellent news, actually. The Charleston Medical Society has invited me to present at their annual meeting in May." "Oh, Thaddeus, that's wonderful," Constance said, her perpetually worried face brightening. "What will you present?" "My albinism study, of course. 3 years of observations documented in detail. They want me to bring Samuel to the presentation." Samuel's hands didn't shake as he poured wine. His face remained neutral. But inside, something crystallized into absolute certainty. "On stage?" Margaret asked. "You'll put him on display in front of the whole medical society?" "Exactly. It's a tremendous honor. The society members include physicians from as far away as Baltimore and Boston. My research will finally receive the recognition it deserves." Thomas Jr. spoke around a mouthful of ham. "Like a circus freak show." "Thomas. Mind your manners," Constance scolded, though she didn't actually disagree with the sentiment. "It's not a freak show," Thaddeus said irritably. "It's scientific presentation. Samuel represents a rare opportunity to observe a documented case of albinism in the Negro race. The medical community will benefit tremendously from my findings." Samuel continued serving, moving silently around the table, his pink eyes revealing nothing. But that night, in his narrow room, he took out his hidden journal and wrote in careful script. "May 15, 1847. The date I will be displayed like an animal before an audience of physicians. The date Thaddeus Grantham expects to receive recognition for 3 years of treating me as a specimen rather than a soul. He will receive recognition, but not the kind he expects. May 10, 1847. 5 days before his scientific triumph. That will be the last night the Granthams ever sleep." Samuel had his date now. The countdown had begun. 120 days to go. February brought a false spring, warm days that coaxed early blooms from the azaleas before a late frost killed them. Samuel found the timing appropriate. False hope before the killing cold. It was during this deceptive warmth that Margaret Grantham, now nearly 18, decided to engage Samuel in conversation. She'd been reading her father's journals, she explained, and found herself troubled by certain aspects of his research. "I don't understand," she said one afternoon when Samuel was dusting the library shelves. "Father writes about you as if you're less than human. But when I observe you, when I hear you speak, you seem as intelligent as anyone I know. Perhaps more so than Thomas." Samuel paused in his dusting. This was dangerous territory. "Miss Margaret, I'm not sure what response you're expecting." "An honest one. Do you have thoughts? Real thoughts, I mean, beyond just following orders?" For a moment, Samuel considered telling her the truth. Considered explaining exactly what thoughts occupied his mind during the long nights. Considered describing the detailed plans he'd made for May 10th. Instead, he said carefully, "Everyone has thoughts, Miss Margaret. The question is whether those thoughts matter to anyone else." "They should matter," she said, and something in her voice sounded almost genuine. "People shouldn't be property. I've been reading abolitionist literature, and I'm starting to believe." She trailed off, and Samuel waited. "I'm starting to believe this entire system is wrong," she finished quietly. Samuel felt something unexpected, hope. Perhaps one person in this cursed household might actually see him as human. Perhaps one Grantham might escape the judgment he planned. That hope lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th day, Samuel was cleaning the hallway outside the parlor when he heard Margaret's voice through the partially open door, speaking with her mother. "He's actually quite intelligent, Mother," Margaret was saying. "Father's documentation proves it. Doesn't that challenge everything we've been taught about racial hierarchy?" There was a long pause. Then Constance responded, her voice sharp. "Don't let your father's scientific hobby confuse you, child. Intelligence in a slave is like a singing bird, a curiosity that amuses us, but it doesn't change what they are. Samuel is property, purchased and paid for. Never forget that, no matter how articulate he might be. But. No buts. Would you question your ownership of a horse because it's well-trained? Samuel is valuable because he's unusual, because he represents your father's scientific achievement. But he's still property, Margaret. He'll always be property. And entertaining abolitionist fantasies will only make you unfit for society. Samuel stood frozen in the hallway, the feather duster hanging limp in his pale hand. Intelligence in a slave is like a singing bird. Property, purchased and paid for. He'll always be property. Whatever small flame of hope had flickered to life in Samuel's chest died in that moment. Snuffed out with the finality of a door slamming shut. Margaret's interest hadn't been genuine humanity. It had been curiosity. The same scientific detachment her father exhibited, just dressed in more compassionate language. She was a Grantham through and through. And she would die like one. That night, Samuel took out his hidden journal and made a notation. I considered mercy for Margaret. I thought perhaps she might be different. I was wrong. They're all the same. All guilty. All complicit. 7 Granthams. 7 deaths. No exceptions. 90 days to go. With the Medical Society presentation approaching, Thaddeus decided to conduct fresh experiments to have the most current data for his presentation. This meant resuming the light sensitivity tests that had tortured Samuel during his first year. On a bright March afternoon, Thaddeus made Samuel stand in the direct sun for 45 minutes while he took measurements and made notes. Samuel's pale skin reddened, then blistered. The pain was immediate and intense. Fascinating, Thaddeus muttered, examining Samuel's arms. The reaction seems more severe than in previous tests. Perhaps continued exposure increases sensitivity rather than building tolerance. Perhaps, Samuel said through gritted teeth, subjecting someone to deliberate pain isn't science. It's cruelty. Thaddeus looked up sharply. Careful, Samuel. I've been patient with your occasional impudence, but there are limits. This research benefits the entire medical community. Your discomfort is a small price to pay for advancing human knowledge. My discomfort. Samuel's pink eyes, watering from the pain, fixed on Thaddeus with an intensity that should have warned the planter. You call torture, discomfort. You call treating a human being like a laboratory rat, science. You've measured everything about me except the one thing that matters. And what's that? My capacity for patience, sir. And what happens when that patience finally runs out? Thaddeus frowned but waved dismissively. More philosophical nonsense. Go to the kitchen and have Dinah apply salve to those burns. We'll resume testing tomorrow. Samuel went to the kitchen, where Dinah applied the salve with gentle hands. You trying to get yourself killed, she whispered. Talking to him like that? No, Samuel replied quietly. I'm trying to keep myself from killing him too early. Dinah's hands stilled. She looked at him for a long moment, then continued applying the salve without another word. That night, Samuel practiced with his knife for 2 hours straight. Precise strikes. Surgical cuts. The exact pressure required to sever the carotid artery in one smooth motion. He'd endured Thaddeus's torture for 3 years. He'd absorbed every humiliation, every test, every moment of being treated as less than human. In 60 days, he would repay every single one. With interest. April arrived with heavy rains that turned the roads to mud and kept the plantation's operations confined. It was perfect weather for Samuel's final preparations. He used the isolation to make his last theft, proper traveling clothes in darker colors, stolen piece by piece from various sources. A wool coat from the overseer's cabin. Dark trousers from the laundry. A hat from the stable storage. He hid these with his growing stash beneath the loose board, $37, the forged freedom papers, the stolen knife, the ledger page documenting his purchase. He also made final confirmations with his 3 allies. Ezra, in the stable, that place I mentioned. 3 miles northeast. When you need it, it'll be there. Dinah, in the kitchen, whatever night you choose, you was here with me until late, helping with work. I'll swear it. Jacob, in the fields, I seen you head toward the river around midnight. You told me you was going fishing. Ain't my fault if you never came back. 3 alibis. 3 false trails. 3 loyal lies that would buy him the hours he needed. Samuel also made his final observations of the house's security measures. Thaddeus still kept a pistol in his bedside table. Samuel had tested it weeks ago and found it unloaded. The powder and shot were kept separately in the study. By the time Thaddeus could load it, the threat would be over. The hunting rifle above the fireplace was loaded, but it hung 10 feet off the ground. Anyone trying to reach it would make noise. The doors locked from the inside. The windows had no bars. The servants' stairs provided silent access to all 3 floors. And the dogs, Caesar and Brutus, could be eliminated with poisoned meat. Samuel had been gradually building their tolerance to his scent over 3 years. Now they barely reacted when he approached their kennels. Everything was ready. Every detail planned. Every contingency considered. On April 30th, exactly 10 days before his planned action, Samuel received an unexpected shock. Thomas Jr., now 15 and fully embracing the cruelty of the planter class, decided it would be amusing to order Samuel to demonstrate his appearance to a group of visiting boys from Charleston. "Show them your freakish eyes, Samuel," Thomas demanded, laughing. "Let them see what a real curiosity looks like." Samuel stood in the plantation yard while 5 teenage boys gawked and made comments. "Is it blind? Can it see in the dark? Does it feel pain like a real person?" Thomas encouraged every question, every humiliation, proud to display his family's unusual property. Samuel endured it with his customary blank expression. But that night, in his narrow room, he added a notation to his mental list. Thomas Jr., 15 years old. Old enough to know better. Old enough to choose cruelty. Old enough to die for it. 10 days to go. May 1st to 9th, 1847, the last week. The final week before May 10th passed with surreal normalcy. The Granthams lived their lives, blissfully unaware that they were counting down to their own deaths. May 1st. Thaddeus practiced his presentation for the medical society, using Samuel as a living prop. He rehearsed his measurements, his findings, his theories about albinism and racial characteristics. Samuel stood silent while Thaddeus pointed out his unusual features to an imaginary audience, his voice filled with professional pride. 7 days, Samuel thought. 7 days until you realize I was studying you all along. May 2nd. Constance took her laudanum as usual, complaining about her nervous condition. Samuel watched carefully, noting the dosage, the timing, how deeply it made her sleep. 6 days until you sleep forever. May 3rd. Margaret asked Samuel to help her rearrange furniture in the parlor. She chatted pleasantly about her upcoming season in Charleston society, the parties she'd attend, the eligible young men she'd meet. "Father says after his presentation, our social standing will improve dramatically," she said. "I might even make a match with a family from Virginia." 5 days until you make no matches at all. May 4th. Thomas Jr. ordered Samuel to polish his boots, then criticized the job as inadequate, forcing him to do it again. The boy was learning the casual cruelty that would have defined his adult life. Would have. For days until you learn the price of cruelty. May 5th. Little Catherine asked Samuel to read to her from a book of fairy tales. She listened with rapt attention, interrupting occasionally to ask questions. "Do you believe in happy endings, Samuel?" she asked. "Sometimes, Miss Catherine. For some people. Will you have a happy ending?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "I'll have the ending I deserve. 3 days until you get the ending we all deserve." May 6th. Ezra found Samuel in the stable, ostensibly checking on a horse. "You ready?" the old man asked quietly. "I've been ready for 3 years." "Then may God have mercy on your soul. Because them folks up at the house ain't gonna have mercy on your body if you fail." "I won't fail. 2 days until I prove him right." May 7th. Thaddeus conducted one final light sensitivity test, making Samuel stand in the sun for 30 minutes while recording measurements for his presentation. The pain was intense, familiar by now, almost comforting in its predictability. "Perfect," Thaddeus said, making notes. "Your skin responds exactly as documented. The medical society will be fascinated." "Yes, sir," Samuel replied. "I'm sure they will. 1 day until you fascinate no one ever again." May 8th. Samuel went through his normal routine with robotic precision. Served breakfast. Cleaned the library. Read to Catherine. Served dinner. Cleaned up. But inside, everything was heightened. Every sound sharper. Every color brighter. Every moment crystallized with perfect clarity. This was what it felt like to know, with absolute certainty, what was coming. That night, he checked his hidden supplies one final time. The knife, sharpened to a razor's edge. The money, $37 in small bills. The freedom papers, perfectly forged. The ledger page, ready to burn. The dark clothes, clean and ready. The poisoned meat for the dogs, prepared and hidden in an oiled cloth. Everything was ready. May 9th. The last full day of the Granthams' lives passed with cruel normalcy. They woke. They ate. They went about their business. They made plans for the next week, the next month, the next year. Plans that would never come to pass. At dinner, Thaddeus was in excellent spirits. 5 more days until the presentation, he announced. Samuel, are you prepared? You'll need to stand perfectly still while I describe the condition. The examination will take at least an hour. I'm prepared, sir, Samuel said, pouring wine with a steady hand. I've been preparing for this for 3 years. Good, good. This will be the culmination of my research. My name will be recognized in medical circles throughout the country. Your name will be recognized, Samuel thought. But not for the reasons you expect. After dinner, as Samuel cleaned up, little Catherine appeared in the kitchen doorway. Samuel. Will you read to me tonight? One more story. Something in his chest tightened. She was 8 years old. Innocent in the way only a child could be. But innocence didn't erase complicity. Didn't change the fact that she would grow up to be Constance, to be Margaret, to perpetuate this system of horror. Not tonight, Miss Catherine. I have work to finish. Tomorrow then? Perhaps, Miss Catherine. There would be no tomorrow. Not for her. Not for any of them. That night, May 9, 1847, Samuel lay in his narrow bed and went through the plan one final time. Midnight, poison the dogs. 12:30 a.m., enter the main house through the unlocked study window. 1 a.m., third floor. The children. 2 a.m., second floor. The master bedroom. 2:30 a.m., final staging. Make it look like robbery. 3 a.m., exit through the study window. 3:15 a.m., reach the swamp cabin. Dawn, the bodies discovered. Noon, he'd be miles away, following the route he'd memorized 3 years ago. The plan was perfect. He'd refined it over 1,342 days. Every step calculated. Every contingency prepared for. Tomorrow night, the Granthams would go to sleep for the last time. And Samuel would finally be free. Not free from bondage. That would come later, on the journey north. But free from the weight of patience. Free from the burden of waiting. Free to collect the debt that was 3 years overdue. Samuel closed his eyes, and for the first time in 1,342 days, he slept peacefully. Because tomorrow, the waiting would finally end. Tomorrow, justice would be served. Tomorrow, the curiosity would become the executioner. 1,342 days of perfect patience. One final night of preparation. Then the debt would be paid in full. The day arrived with mockingbirds singing in the live oaks and sunlight filtering through Spanish moss like lace curtains. It was a beautiful morning, the kind that poets wrote about and painters tried to capture on canvas. The Grantham family had no idea it was the last morning they would ever see. Samuel woke at dawn, as he always did. He dressed in his usual servant's attire, the black suit that made his pale skin seem almost luminescent. He went through his morning routine with mechanical precision. He started the fire in the kitchen. He helped prepare breakfast. He served the family their eggs and ham and grits with the same neutral expression he'd worn for 3 years. Good morning, Samuel, Thaddeus said, unfolding his newspaper. 5 more days until the presentation. Are you nervous? No, sir, Samuel replied, pouring coffee. I'm quite calm. Excellent. I need you at your best. This presentation will establish my reputation in the scientific community. Your reputation will be established, Samuel thought. Just not the one you're expecting. The day proceeded with cruel normalcy. The family went about their business. Thaddeus worked in his study. Constance managed the household. The children pursued their various activities. And Samuel moved through it all like a ghost, serving, cleaning, observing. Waiting. At dinner, the family was in good spirits. Thomas Jr. was excited about a hunting trip planned for the following week. Margaret was discussing new dresses she wanted. Little Catherine chattered about a party one of her friends was hosting. Plans for a future that would never arrive. Samuel served the meal in silence, his pink eyes reflecting candlelight, his pale hands steady as he poured wine and cleared plates. You're quite efficient tonight, Samuel, Constance observed. Very attentive. Thank you, ma'am. I'm simply doing my duty. As you should, Thaddeus said. Though I must say, after 3 years, you've become quite valuable to this household. Perhaps after the presentation, I'll write a paper on the proper management of educated slaves. You'd be the perfect case study. Yes, sir. That would be fascinating. 3 years of being a case study, Samuel thought. 3 years of being treated like a laboratory specimen. Tonight, the experiment concludes. And you won't like the results. After dinner, the family retired to the parlor. Samuel cleaned the dining room with meticulous care, taking his time, letting the evening deepen into night. At 9 o'clock, Constance took her laudanum and retired to her bedroom. At 9:30, the children went upstairs. Samuel could hear their footsteps on the ceiling, the sound of doors closing, the house settling into its nightly rhythm. At 10 o'clock, Thaddeus went to his study to read, as he did every night. At 10:30, he finally retired to bed. By 11 o'clock, the entire house was dark except for a single candle in Samuel's small room off the kitchen. He sat on his narrow bed, hands folded in his lap, and waited. Listening to the house. Listening to the silence. Listening to the sound of 7 people sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that they would never wake up. At exactly midnight, Samuel rose from his bed. He dressed in the dark clothes he'd hidden for months, the black trousers, the dark shirt, the wool coat that would camouflage him in shadows. He took the knife from its hiding place beneath the loose board. 8 inches of perfectly sharpened steel, wrapped in oiled cloth. The blade gleamed in the moonlight filtering through his window. He also took the poisoned meat he prepared, 2 large pieces of ham soaked in a mixture that would put the dogs into a deep, silent sleep within minutes. Not death. He didn't want barking or whimpering. Just silence. Samuel moved through the kitchen like a ghost, his soft shoes making no sound on the wooden floor. He unlocked the back door, the hinges well-oiled from months of careful maintenance. Outside, the May night was warm and humid, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and impending rain. A thin crescent moon provided just enough light to see by. The dog kennels were 50 feet from the main house, near the stable where Ezra slept. Samuel moved carefully, staying in shadows, his pale skin almost glowing in the darkness. Caesar and Brutus lifted their heads when he approached, but they didn't bark. 3 years of gradual conditioning had made them accept his scent. They knew him. They trusted him. "Good boys," Samuel whispered, holding out the poisoned meat. "One last treat." The dogs took the meat eagerly, their tails wagging. Within 3 minutes, they were lying down, their breathing deep and steady. Within 5 minutes, they were unconscious. Samuel waited another 2 minutes to be certain, then turned back toward the house. The first obstacle was eliminated. Now came the real work. The study window, as Samuel had confirmed earlier that day, was unlocked. Thaddeus always opened it slightly for air circulation, convinced that the locks on the main doors provided sufficient security. Samuel pushed it open slowly, wincing at a slight creak, then froze, listening. Silence. He pulled himself through the window with practiced ease, landing silently on the study floor. The room smelled of tobacco and old books, familiar scents that had been the background of his enslavement. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust fully to the darkness. His light-sensitive eyes, the very feature Thaddeus had studied so obsessively, gave him a distinct advantage in the dark. He could see details that would be invisible to normal vision. The irony wasn't lost on him. "You tested my eyes to document my weakness," he thought. "You never realized you were giving me my greatest weapon." Samuel unwrapped the knife, feeling its weight in his hand. Perfectly balanced. Perfectly sharp. 3 years of patience had led to this moment. 1,342 days of waiting. And now, finally, it was time. He moved to the study door, testing the handle. It opened silently. Beyond it, the main hallway stretched toward the servant stairs that led to the upper floors. 47 steps to the master bedroom. But first, the 3rd floor. First, the children. Samuel climbed the servant stairs with infinite care, avoiding the 3 steps that creaked. His breathing was controlled, measured, almost meditative. He'd practiced this route 100 times in his mind. Every step was memorized. The 3rd floor hallway was darker than the lower floors, with no windows to let in moonlight. But Samuel's eyes had adjusted perfectly. He could see the 3 bedroom doors as clearly as if it were day. Catherine's room at the far end. Thomas's room in the middle. Margaret's room closest to the main staircase. Samuel stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, the knife heavy in his hand. This was the moment of decision. The point of no return. He thought of Dinah's daughter Sarah, sold south at 7 years old, crying for her mother. He thought of Jacob's sister, worked to death in the rice fields at 14. He thought of his own sister, dead before she reached Catherine's age. He thought of 3 years of being measured like livestock, tested like an animal, displayed like a curiosity. The children were innocent, yes. But they would grow up to perpetuate this system. Catherine would become Constance. Thomas would become Thaddeus. Margaret would teach her own children that owning human beings was natural and right. The only way to stop the cycle was to end it completely. Samuel moved to Catherine's door first. It opened silently. Inside, the little girl slept in her bed, a porcelain doll clutched in her arms. Moonlight from her window illuminated her face, peaceful and dreaming. Samuel stood over her for perhaps 30 seconds, the knife raised. She brought me books, a voice whispered in his mind. She treated me kindly. She would have grown up to own slaves, another voice answered. She would have smiled while buying and selling human beings. She's 8 years old. Dinah's Sarah was 7 when they sold her. The knife descended with surgical precision. Catherine died without waking, without pain, still holding her doll. Samuel cleaned the blade on her bedsheet, his hands steady, his breath even. 1. Thomas's room was next. The boy slept on his stomach, his face turned toward the door. Samuel could see the beginning of whiskers on his chin, the first signs of the man he would have become. Would have. Thomas woke just enough to see the pale face above him, to register confusion, to try to cry out. But the knife was faster than speech. The carotid artery opened cleanly. Thomas's eyes widened in the darkness, then glazed. 2. Margaret's room was last on the 3rd floor. She slept on her side, her long brown hair spread across the pillow. She'd been reading, a book lay open on the bedside table. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Samuel noted with bitter irony. She'd been educating herself about slavery's horrors even as she continued to benefit from them. Margaret's eyes opened fully as Samuel approached. She saw him clearly in the moonlight. Recognition flooded her face. Samuel, she whispered. What are you? The knife cut off her question. Her eyes held his for one terrible moment, filled with betrayal, confusion, terror. Then nothing. 3. Samuel cleaned the knife again and stood in the hallway, listening. The house remained silent. No alarm had been raised. No one had woken. Downstairs, Thaddeus and Constance Grantham slept peacefully, completely unaware that their children were already dead. Samuel checked his internal clock. It was 1:15 a.m. He'd been faster than anticipated. 15 minutes for 3 lives. Now came the main event. Now came Thaddeus. Samuel descended to the 2nd floor using the servant stairs. The master bedroom was at the front of the house, its doors standing slightly ajar, a habit of Thaddeus's who liked air circulation even in cooler weather. Samuel paused outside the door, listening. 2 sets of breathing. Deep. Steady. The breathing of people who slept without fear, without concern, secure in their power and privilege. That security was about to be shattered. Samuel pushed the door open slowly. It swung inward without sound, revealing the large 4-poster bed where Thaddeus and Constance slept. Constance lay on the right side, facing away from her husband, her breathing deep and even from the laudanum. She would never wake. Samuel had calculated the dosage she'd taken, knew she was beyond consciousness. Thaddeus slept on his back, snoring softly, one hand thrown across his chest. His face in repose looked almost peaceful, the face of a man with a clear conscience. But his conscience should not have been clear. Samuel moved to Constance's side first. This death would be mercy, quick and painless. She would feel nothing, know nothing. One moment sleep, the next moment nothing at all. The knife did its work with practiced efficiency. 4. Then Samuel moved to Thaddeus's side of the bed. This was the one that mattered. This was the one who'd purchased him, studied him, displayed him. This was the one who'd spent 3 years treating him as a curiosity rather than a human being. This one needed to understand. Samuel placed his pale hand over Thaddeus's mouth, pressing down firmly. The planter's eyes snapped open immediately, the instinct of a man who'd spent his life in control. Confusion transformed to recognition, recognition transformed to terror. He tried to struggle, tried to reach for the pistol he kept in his bedside table. But Samuel had removed it hours ago, during the afternoon when the family was having tea in the garden. Thaddeus's eyes were wide, bulging, his face reddening as he tried to breathe against the hand covering his mouth and nose. Samuel leaned close, his pink eyes inches from Thaddeus's terrified gaze, and whispered. 3 years, sir. 3 years you've studied me. Measured my skull. Tested my skin. Documented my every physical characteristic. 3 years you've treated me as a specimen rather than a man. Thaddeus made muffled sounds, trying to scream, trying to plead, trying to do anything that might save him. But you never measured the one thing that mattered, Samuel continued, his voice perfectly calm. You never measured my patience. You never documented my memory. You never tested how long I could wait, how thoroughly I could plan, how precisely I could execute revenge. The knife came up, the blade catching moonlight. Every measurement you took, I took one back. Every test you ran on me, I ran on you. Every time you displayed me to your friends, I was memorizing your patterns, your schedules, your vulnerabilities. Thaddeus's struggles were weakening now, his oxygen-starved brain shutting down, his body giving up. You thought I was the specimen, sir. You were wrong. You were the experiment. And this, the knife moved closer, this is the conclusion. Samuel let the blade speak for him then. One precise cut, surgical in its efficiency. The carotid artery opened cleanly. Blood, dark and hot, poured onto the white sheets. Thaddeus Grantham died staring into those pink eyes he'd found so fascinating, finally understanding, too late, what his 3 years of scientific curiosity had produced. 5. Samuel stood beside the bed for a long moment, looking down at the bodies. Thaddeus and Constance Grantham, plantation owners, pillars of Charleston society, dead in their own bed. He felt no triumph. No joy. Just a cold, quiet satisfaction. The debt was paid. But he wasn't finished yet. There were still 2 more lives to take. Samuel moved through the house toward the kitchen servants' quarters, where old Ruth slept. She was nearly 70, the deaf cook who'd been kind to him in her way, who'd never participated in the cruelty but had never challenged it either. He found her sleeping peacefully, her weathered face relaxed, her breath wheezing slightly. Samuel stood over her bed, the knife in his hand, still wet with Grantham blood. He could kill her. Should kill her, by the logic of leaving no witnesses. But Ruth was deaf. She couldn't describe sounds she hadn't heard. She couldn't testify about conversations she couldn't have overheard. And her age would make her testimony suspect anyway. More importantly, someone needed to find the bodies. Someone needed to raise the alarm. And that delay would buy Samuel the hours he needed to disappear into the swamp. He left Ruth alive, but took something from the room, her best shawl, which he would leave as false evidence near the river. Then he moved to his final target. The overseer lived in a small house near the slave quarters, a man who'd spent 20 years enforcing Thaddeus's will with a whip he called Persuader. Samuel had debated whether to include Kate's in his revenge. The man wasn't family. But he'd been Thaddeus's instrument of terror, the one who'd executed every punishment, every whipping, every brutal display of power. He deserved to die. Samuel entered the overseer's house through an unlocked window. Kate slept fully clothed on a narrow bed, a bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him. This death was quick. No speeches. No revelations. Just the knife doing its work. 6. Samuel left Kate's house and returned to the main mansion for the final phase of his plan. Samuel moved through the Grantham house one last time, staging the scene carefully. He took valuables, Thaddeus's gold pocket watch, Constance's jewelry box, silver candlesticks from the dining room, cash from the study desk. He made it look like robbery, like violence born of greed rather than calculated revenge. But he also left clues, deliberate breadcrumbs that would tell a different story to anyone who looked closely enough. He went to Thaddeus's study and placed a single item on the desk where it would be found immediately, the page from the Plantation ledger showing his purchase price. May 14, 1844, one male Negro, age 22, afflicted with albinism. Purchase price, $750. Let them find it. Let them wonder. Let them understand that this wasn't random violence but calculated justice. Samuel also took one final item, Thaddeus's journal, the 3-year documentation of his albinism study. He would burn it page by page on his journey north, watching each measurement, each observation, each dehumanizing note turn to ash. Samuel left through the study window at exactly 3 in the morning. Behind him, the Grantham plantation stood silent in the darkness. 7 people dead. 7 debts paid. 7 lives ended to balance years of dehumanization. He moved quickly now, no longer needing stealth. The dogs slept on in their poisoned slumber. The house was silent as a tomb, which it now was. Samuel headed northeast, toward the swamp, toward the abandoned cabin Ezra had told him about 3 years ago. His pale skin, which had been his curse in daylight, became his camouflage in the moonless night. His sensitive eyes, which Thaddeus had tested so obsessively, allowed him to see every root, every branch, every obstacle. He moved through the darkness like a ghost. Behind him, the Grantham plantation held its terrible secret for 3 more hours. Ahead of him, freedom waited. Not just freedom from bondage, but freedom from patience. Freedom from waiting. Freedom from being anyone's curiosity, anyone's specimen, anyone's property. Samuel reached the swamp cabin as dawn began to gray the eastern sky. He hid the stolen valuables, changed into darker clothes, and ate the dried food Dinah had given him weeks ago. Then he lay down on the rough wooden floor and slept. For the first time in 3 years, Samuel slept without dreams. The debt was paid. The waiting was over. And when he woke, he would begin his journey to a freedom purchased not with money, but with blood. Old Ruth discovered the bodies at dawn when Catherine failed to appear for breakfast. The cook's screams, though silent to her own deaf ears, brought field hands running from the quarters. They found her standing in the third-floor hallway, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. What they saw in that hallway, and in the rooms beyond, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 3 children dead in their beds. Their throats cut with surgical precision. Word spread quickly to the second floor, where they found Thaddeus and Constance Grantham, dead in their blood-soaked bed. Someone rode to find Virgil Cates, and found him dead in his cottage. By 8 that morning, a rider had reached Charleston with news of the massacre. By noon, Sheriff Marcus Penton had arrived with a dozen deputies. By evening, the entire Low Country was in an uproar. 7 members of one of Charleston's most prominent families, murdered in their beds. The investigation quickly focused on Samuel. He was the only person missing from the plantation. His room had been cleared of personal belongings. And on Thaddeus's desk, they found the damning evidence, the ledger page documenting Samuel's purchase. It's obvious, Sheriff Penton declared. The albino slave murdered the family and fled. We need to organize search parties immediately. Bloodhounds were brought from neighboring plantations. The sheriff was confident that Samuel's unusual scent would make him easy to track. But the dogs lost the trail at the Ashley River, just as Samuel had planned. When they questioned the other enslaved people, Dinah and Jacob provided their alibis exactly as rehearsed. Dinah, Samuel was helping me in the kitchen until late. He left around midnight, said he was going to his room. Jacob, I seen him heading toward the river around midnight. Said something about checking the fishing lines. Their stories didn't quite align, but that only added to the confusion. Ezra, when questioned, simply said he'd seen and heard nothing unusual. The search parties combed the swamps, but the treacherous ground and Samuel's careful planning kept them from finding the abandoned cabin where he'd hidden. The Charleston Courier ran a front-page story that shocked the entire South. Grantham family massacred, albino slave suspected. In the most brutal crime this region has witnessed in recent memory, 7 members of the Grantham family were found murdered in their beds on the morning of May 11, Colonel Thaddeus Grantham, his wife Constance, and their 3 children Margaret, 18, Thomas Jr., 15, and Catherine, 8, were discovered with their throats cut. The family overseer, Mr. Virgil Cates, was also found dead. Authorities report that an enslaved man known as Samuel, notable for his unusual albino appearance, is missing from the property. Valuables including cash and jewelry were stolen, suggesting robbery as a motive. Sheriff Marcus Penton has offered a reward of $500 for information leading to Samuel's capture. He is described as approximately 22 years of age, with pale white skin, white blonde hair, and pink eyes. He is considered extremely dangerous. The article made no mention of the ledger page. That detail was quietly suppressed. Within 72 hours, the newspaper's owner received private visits from 3 of Charleston's wealthiest planters. No further coverage appeared. 3 days after the murders, 15 of the region's most powerful planters met in a private room at the Charleston Hotel. The discussion, recorded in fragmentary notes that were later mostly destroyed, revealed their true concerns. The question isn't whether we'll catch him, one planter argued. The question is what we do if we catch him alive. A public trial would be devastating, another agreed. Every newspaper from Boston to New Orleans would cover it. Every abolitionist would use it as ammunition. Samuel was educated, a third pointed out. He could read, write, speak articulately. If he testifies, if he explains why he did it, what it was like to be treated as Thaddeus's specimen. The room fell silent as they considered the implications. Then we ensure there's no trial, Sheriff Penton said finally. If Samuel is found, he'll be shot while resisting arrest. Simple as that. And the story? The official story is that he drowned attempting to cross the Ashley River. His body was recovered and buried in an unmarked grave. Case closed. But what about the other slaves? They know what really happened. The other slaves, one planter said coldly, will keep silent if they know what's good for them. We'll make sure they understand the consequences of spreading dangerous stories. And so it was decided. The truth about the Grantham massacre would be buried almost as deeply as the family themselves. But truth, as always, had a way of surviving. Samuel spent 7 days in a swamp cabin, living on dried meat and creek water, waiting for the initial fury of the search to exhaust itself. During those days alone, he experienced something unexpected, not guilt, but a hollow victory that tasted like ashes. He'd achieved what he planned for 3 years. He'd taken revenge on the family that treated him as a curiosity. He'd made them pay for every humiliation, every test, every moment of being displayed like an exotic animal. But the price of that revenge was that he could never be fully human again. He'd become the monster they'd always feared enslaved people might be. Yet when he thought of Catherine's face, of Margaret's terror, of Thaddeus's final understanding, he found he couldn't regret it. They'd bought and sold human beings. They'd broken families. They'd destroyed lives with casual indifference. They'd treated him as less than human for 3 years. His victims had been guilty. Not by action perhaps, but by participation, by benefit, by their willful blindness to the suffering their prosperity required. After 7 days, Samuel began moving north, traveling only at night, his pale skin almost glowing in the darkness, his sensitive eyes allowing him to see what others couldn't. He had his forged freedom papers. He had money. He had a route memorized from 3 years of studying maps in the Grantham library. And he had time. All the time in the world. But Samuel didn't just flee. He hunted. Over the next 4 months, 6 more plantations reported similar crimes. Always the same pattern, families woke to find their safes opened, money stolen, documents taken. And always, a single clue left behind, a pale handprint on a windowsill. A white hair on a desk. Evidence that couldn't be missed, evidence that was clearly intentional. Samuel was making a point. He was still out there. Still free. Still operating with the same precision that had let him kill 7 people without leaving useful evidence. At the Rutledge plantation, he stole $200 and left a note in Thaddeus's handwriting, a note Samuel had learned to forge perfectly. You collected me like a specimen. You displayed me like a trophy. Did you think I wasn't learning your patterns, your weaknesses? Every plantation house is the same, confident in its walls, secure in its power, blind to the threat you've created by treating human beings as property. Sleep well, gentlemen. The note was unsigned, but newspapers got hold of it. Abolitionist publications ran it alongside editorials. The whole South began to understand what Samuel represented. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a symbol. Proof that enslaved people could plan, could calculate, could execute perfect revenge. The reward increased to $5,000, an enormous sum. Professional slave catchers converged on South Carolina. But Samuel stayed ahead of them all. In July 1847, Samuel did something audacious that revealed his confidence. He had his photograph taken. In Columbia, South Carolina, nearly 100 miles inland, he approached a traveling photographer named Henry Dewars. I'll pay $5 for a portrait, Samuel said, wearing tinted spectacles that hid his distinctive eyes. Dewars, excited by the generous payment, set up his daguerreotype equipment. Samuel posed in profile, his pale face captured in perfect detail. Why do you want this? Dewars asked. So there's a record, Samuel replied. Of what I really looked like. Not what they turned me into. Then he paid in cash and disappeared before Dewars could process what he'd said. The resulting photograph showed Samuel clearly, pale skin, distinctive features, but his expression was neutral, almost amused. Copies were made and distributed to law enforcement throughout the South. But the gesture seemed like mockery. Samuel had voluntarily created documentation, then vanished again. Between May and September 1847, Samuel hit 8 plantations total. Each one carefully chosen. Each one representing a planter who'd attended one of Thaddeus's dinner parties, who'd stared at Samuel like a curiosity, who'd discussed him as if he weren't human. He wasn't just stealing. He was collecting a broader debt. At the Patterson plantation, he found letters documenting the sale of a young girl to a New Orleans brothel. He left these prominently displayed, exposing secrets the family wanted hidden. At the Williams plantation, he burned their ledgers, destroying documentation of human ownership. He was waging a careful campaign to expose the secrets of the planter class, to reveal the private cruelties they hid from public view. By September, paranoia gripped South Carolina. Planters slept in locked rooms with loaded pistols. They hired armed guards. They installed bars on windows. But these precautions only seemed to challenge Samuel further. The more security they added, the more boldly he operated. On September 10, exactly 1 day before his planned final exit from South Carolina, Samuel made his most audacious move. He returned to Grantham Plantation. The estate had been purchased by Thaddeus's cousin Charles Grantham, who'd brought his own family from Virginia. Charles had gotten the property at a reduced price because of its dark history. But Charles had also brought something Samuel needed: detailed maps of the Underground Railroad routes through Virginia. Documents he kept in Thaddeus's former study because he secretly sympathized with abolition while publicly maintaining the appearance of a slaveholder. Samuel entered through the same study window he'd used 5 months earlier. He moved through the house with the confidence of someone who'd once lived there. He spent 20 minutes in the study, taking the maps he needed, memorizing routes, copying names of safe houses. But he also left something behind: his photograph, placed on the desk where Thaddeus's body had been found. On the back, Samuel had written in his perfect script: "Science teaches that every action has consequences. You measured me, documented me, displayed me as if I were a specimen rather than a soul. These are the consequences. Sleep well in your plantation houses. Remember that the curiosity you owned once walked your halls, knew your secrets, and chose his moment. I was never your specimen. You were mine." When Charles Grantham found the photograph the next morning, he immediately contacted authorities. But Samuel was already gone, moving north with the confidence of someone who'd planned every detail. The last confirmed sighting of Samuel came on September 15, 1847, in Richmond, Virginia. A hotel clerk reported serving a pale gentleman with tinted spectacles who paid cash, spoke with refined vocabulary, and left after one night, heading north. After that, Samuel vanished into the complex network of the Underground Railroad like smoke into fog. Reports came sporadically: Maryland, then Pennsylvania, then New York. Each one less reliable than the last. The official investigation declared him dead in 1849, claiming he'd perished crossing into Pennsylvania. But the truth was more complex. In 1883, a conductor on the Underground Railroad named Thomas Garrett published his private journal. In it, he claimed to have helped a man matching Samuel's description reach Ontario in October 1847. Garrett's entry read: "Today I helped a man unlike any I've encountered before. Pale as moonlight, with eyes the color of rose quartz. He traveled with stolen maps, spoke with the careful diction of someone educated by his oppressors, and carried papers that would pass any inspection. When we reached the Canadian border, he took from his pocket a single piece of paper, a page from a plantation ledger documenting his sale. He fed it to the stove and watched it burn with an expression I can only describe as peaceful. Not triumph. Not joy. Just peace. That page said I was worth $750, he told me. I've proven I'm worth considerably more." I asked him what he planned to do with his freedom. "I plan to live," he said simply. "For the first time in my life, I plan to simply live. No more waiting. No more planning. No more debt to collect. Just life." I wish him well. If any man has earned his freedom through determination and calculation, it's this pale ghost who spent 3 years studying his oppressors before destroying them. Garrett's journal was never officially verified, but historians have found no evidence to contradict it. In the slave quarters of South Carolina, Georgia, and points north, Samuel's story took on different meanings. Some versions said he reached Canada and lived to old age, never once looking back at the South. Others claimed he died crossing the Pennsylvania border, his body lost in some forgotten grave. A few whispered that he was never real at all, just a symbol of what resistance could look like when patience met opportunity. But what remained consistent across all versions was the lesson. The most dangerous weapon isn't strength. It's patience. The most effective revenge isn't rage. It's calculation. And the people who own you, who study you, who display you as curiosities, they might be the ones under observation all along. Parents told their children about the pale man who was studied like an animal and who responded by studying his captors in return. The story carried warnings for both sides. For the enslaved, it offered hope that resistance was possible if you were patient enough. For the enslavers, it promised that cruelty would eventually be repaid. The Charleston elite worked systematically to erase Samuel's story from official records. The Charleston Courier published its false report of his drowning. The case was officially closed. References to the massacre were removed from public documents. Dr. Whitfield, the physician who'd examined Samuel, became an unlikely advocate for abolition. In his private journal, discovered after his death in 1872, he wrote, "I spent my life studying the human body, convinced I understood its varieties and limitations. Then I met a young man whose appearance fascinated me and whose mind I underestimated completely. His capacity for strategic thinking exceeded that of any military officer I've known. His patience surpassed that of any scholar. His precision rivaled that of any surgeon. And I helped Thaddeus display him as a curiosity. I discussed his intelligence as if it were an oddity. I treated him as a specimen rather than a person. I wonder now what other assumptions I've made about people based on their appearance. What other intelligences I've failed to recognize because they came in forms I've been taught to view as inferior. Samuel's greatest revenge wasn't killing the Granthams. It was proving that every assumption we'd made about racial inferiority was wrong. And making us so afraid of that truth that we had to bury his story entirely. The Grantham plantation never recovered. Charles Grantham abandoned it within a year, freed his 30 enslaved people, and moved to Philadelphia where he devoted himself to abolitionist work. I saw what treating people as property produced, he told a reporter in 1855. I saw the ledgers documenting human sales. I saw the consequences of viewing intelligence as a curiosity rather than as proof of our shared humanity. And I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering if tonight would be the night my own curiosities came for me. The plantation was sold and broken into smaller parcels. The main house stood empty for years, locals claiming it was haunted by the ghosts of the family murdered there. Eventually it was torn down. By 1860, nothing remained but foundation stones and the live oaks that had witnessed everything. But physical places aren't the only repositories of memory. What makes Samuel's story so powerful, so terrifying to those who tried to suppress it, is what it revealed about the nature of slavery itself. It proved that enslaved people weren't passive victims but human beings capable of remarkable calculation, patience, and strategic thinking. It demonstrated that treating people as specimens, as curiosities, as objects of study, was not neutral scholarship but violence that would eventually demand accounting. It showed that every measurement taken, every humiliation inflicted, every moment of being displayed as less than human was being recorded, catalogued, remembered. And most frighteningly for the planter class, it proved that their security was illusory. That locked doors and loaded pistols couldn't protect them from someone who'd spent years learning their patterns, memorizing their vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment. Samuel's greatest weapon wasn't his knife. It was his patience. His greatest triumph wasn't the 7 deaths. It was proving that the curiosity purchased for $750 had been worth far more than the Granthams ever imagined, just not in the way they'd expected. Did Samuel truly escape to Canada? Did he live to see slavery's abolition? Did he ever find peace with what he'd done? The historical record provides no definitive answers. Perhaps he died crossing the Pennsylvania border, as the official report claimed. Perhaps he lived to old age in Ontario, his story kept secret to protect others. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. But in another sense, it doesn't matter. Samuel's story had already done its work. It had exposed the fundamental contradiction in the slave system, that people held as property were calculating, planning, remembering every cruelty and measuring every opportunity. It had left a question that plantation owners across the South couldn't escape. When you sleep in your locked rooms, secure in your power and convinced of your superiority, how do you know someone isn't watching? How do you know that the person you've reduced to a curiosity isn't learning you in return? How do you know that tonight won't be the night when 3 years of observation yields its calculated reward? These questions haunted more than one planter's dreams in the years following 1847. And they should have. Because Samuel's greatest lesson was this. You cannot treat people as less than human without creating the conditions for your own destruction. You cannot build a society on viewing others as property without eventually meeting someone who's learned to use your assumptions against you. And when that meeting comes, all your locked doors and armed guards will mean nothing. Because the threat isn't outside your walls. It never was. The threat is in every ledger documenting human sales. Every scientific study measuring skull dimensions. Every casual conversation discussing human beings as if they were curiosities. The threat is in the system itself. And no amount of security can protect you from the consequences of what you've created. In the silent swamps of South Carolina, where Spanish moss hangs like ghosts from ancient trees, some say you can still hear echoes of May 10, 1847. Not supernatural sounds, but something more profound, the memory of patience rewarded, of justice delivered, of a debt paid in full. The story of Samuel, the albino slave who was purchased as a curiosity and became an executioner, remains one of the most suppressed chapters in American history. But suppression isn't the same as erasure. In the oral traditions of black communities throughout the South, his story persists. Passed from grandmother to grandchild. Whispered in church basements. Shared in moments when the weight of history needs to be acknowledged. And the lesson endures. The most dangerous weapon isn't rage. It's patience. The most effective resistance isn't violence. It's calculation. And sometimes, the greatest triumph is simply surviving long enough to see justice served, even if you have to serve it yourself. 7 people went to sleep on May 10, 1847. Only one woke up. And that one had pale skin, pink eyes, and 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days of perfect patience behind him. The Granthams thought they'd purchased a curiosity. They actually purchased their own destruction. They just had to wait 3 years to find out. And by then, it was far too late. What do you think happened to Samuel? Did he make it to freedom in Canada? Or did he die trying? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of calculated revenge and suppressed history chilled you to the bone, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the stories that official history tried to bury, and there are so many more waiting in the shadows. Share this with someone who needs to understand that patience is power, and that every system of oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction. The past is never as simple as we're taught. Some stories demand to be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. See you in the next one, where we'll dig up another chapter of history that time tried to erase. Remember, the pale ghost walked free. And his story? It still walks among us today.